Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Anya Salama. I'm a co-chair of 100 Strong. My compatriot Corinne, who you'll be hearing from shortly, is here as well. And we're thrilled today to welcome Nick Kristof to talk about his new memoir, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. I found this to be a very impactful and hopeful and heart-wrenching read, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. This is actually the second time Nick has spoken with us. His first time was in 2021 when he and his wife Cheryl discussed their last book, Tightrope: Americans Reaching for Hope. Nick's reporting on human rights and social justice issues in the US and all around the world obviously aligns with the Save the Children's mission. And as we all read, he often ventures into very tough contexts, shedding light and drawing attention to things that matter deeply to us and to our work for children and families. And we're immensely grateful for his dedication. We'd like to also particularly thank, from the 100 Strong side, Nick's reporting on gender-based violence in Sierra Leone. Many of you know of our work, our pilot project in Kowloon province over the past few years that related to ending child marriage. And several of us have been to Sierra Leone, and more recently, we were thrilled to help the First Lady who helped pass the law outlawing child marriage. So this is all related to Nick's reporting, and it goes back to that. And so many other parts of the world have been impacted by his work. We're also lucky to have Jennifer Garner with us today, a member of 100 Strong, who knows Nick very well. She's a Save the Children trustee and ambassador, and she's a passionate advocate for children in the rural US. Several of us actually are traveling to rural Kentucky next month, so please join us if you can. Jennifer and Nick go way back. They share roots in rural America and a deep commitment to uplifting communities like the ones where they grew up, and like the Kentucky communities we'll visit next month. Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you now to introduce Nick and share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you, Nick, for being here. And hi, hello, everyone. This is so exciting. I love getting us all together. My name is Jennifer Garner. I have been working with SAVE 16 years as of last week because I was pregnant with my 15-year-old. It was the middle of August. So every year I'm like, yep, nope, it's time. I love the 100 Strong organization's focus on harnessing the brilliant hearts and pragmatism of powerful women. There is nothing better. I love that this group just gets it done. I have the awesome responsibility and privilege of introducing our esteemed guest, Nick Kristof. I know we're all familiar with his work, so I won't belabor it, but I will remind us of his 2 Pulitzer Prizes, the first with his wife, the extraordinary Cheryl Wu Dunn, covering China's Tiananmen Square democracy movement, the first married couple to receive the Pulitzer, which is kind of a fun fact, and his second for the coverage of the genocide in Darfur in 2006. And Anya is right. Nick and I do share a lot in common, our rural upbringings and a shared passion for farming. We both love farms. Nick is a farmer now, by the way. I was surprised to realize as I was thinking this over that over the years, I've accumulated enough memories to spend this entire time telling you about my friend, but I will try to encapsulate our experiences together into a few moments that may give you a little bit of insight into who Nick is. When I was introduced to Nick at Save the Children Gala or something, I chided him for always recommending in his column the very excellent nurse-family partnership as the ideal home visitation model. Why not Save the Children? I mean, I'm a little competitive. We are less expensive. We create local jobs. We're a more sustainable model of encouraging parents to sing to, read to, play with, and read to their babies. Nick told me, look, you're great. I'm here. I love Save the Children, but you don't have the data from a longitudinal study to prove out your model. It made me lose my mind. Of course, Mark and Betsy were already hard at work on our model and already hard at work on this. And eventually our version of these studies proved our model, and Nick has been incredibly generous to us in his column, his documentary, and even as in his books as resources for how to help kids like the kids that he grew up with. You push us to be better, Nick, and we are really grateful. So the second moment is years ago, Nick asked me to join him in a documentary based on his and Cheryl's excellent book, A Path Appears. We shot a segment about education as a way out of poverty in West Virginia, 45 minutes from where I grew up. This segment, by the way, has been enormously impactful for Save the Children. We have been sharing it, showing it for the past 10 years, I am sure. So I'm available, Nick, whenever you are ready to do another one. During this shoot, I saw two things that I want to share with you. And if you think this is creepy that I remember these things, my apologies, Mr. Kristof. It's just, they made an impact. So both of them made me like, one of them was we were in a field. The detritus of filmmaking was all around us and the crew was getting ready to go. There was chaos, in other words. And on a folding chair with a computer perched on his knees, I watched Nick write and submit his column for the New York Times and was just like, wait a minute, this thing that we all, we're all subscribed to, we hang on, we read with, you just pounded that out like right here in the middle of this field in West Virginia. He did. I can confirm. The other was watching the journalists in action with cameras rolling and the notebook open. The conversations at hand would start on rural poverty, but in the process, Nick would sniff out a whole other side of the story. And suddenly he would be asking without apology and with such kindness questions that this West Virginia girl would never even think to ask. I don't think I've ever spoken to my mother about these things. As we sat in a trailer with a struggling young mother, Nick gently uncovered the sexual abuse she had suffered as a child. He followed the lead without ever putting the woman in a defensive posture, and the conversation that followed was beautiful and enlightening. Similarly, at a local church we visited for its food bank, Nick noticed that every hour on the hour, there was either an Alcoholics and or a Narcotics Anonymous meeting listed. And he found and asked the local minister about the drug problem in the community. Again, this was not something we were focused on in this piece, although of course it's related. But the conversation again took a turn to the deep. I can't recall if this moment made the final cut of the documentary, but I will never forget the minister saying to Nick, "Pray for my flock." Do you remember this, Nick? Pray for my flock. Every week, I bury young parents who were children only yesterday. There will be no one left at the end of this. Pray for my flock. Whew, never forget it. The third moment, when I really got a peek behind the Kristof curtain, and which, by the way, this is available to all of you. Nick and Cheryl lay it all out in their amazing book, Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. And Nick, even more so in Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, which, by the way, I know that all of you have either read it or will, but please use any social media, book clubs, advance this book. It's so important to remember to put hope at the forefront of all of our work. And this is an amazing example. So please share it out and make sure your friends are buying it as well. So this memory is about Tightrope. Nick invited me to do something I had never done before and haven't done since, which was narrate the audiobook available on Audible. Spending several days in a recording studio with stories from Nick's childhood, I grew to love the kids from his school bus. I grieved for the Knapp family and rooted for any moment of triumph that I could find in there. I saw two things so clearly: the miracle of Nick's ascent out of that town into one of our great thinkers and writers, and the depth of his knowing about deaths of despair, and the depth of his heart and desire for justice. I could keep going through Nick's Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is, Run for Governor, and the many ways he's shown up for Save the Children since, including in Seattle with Mark and me less than a year ago. Instead, I will give the man a chance to speak for himself. Please welcome our guest, Nick Kristof.
Oh. Thank you, Jan. Thank you so much. And, thank you for the very kind words, but also just thank you so much for what you're doing for the kids around the country. And thanks to all of you. I mean, I've learned firsthand to admire what SAVE is doing around this country and around the world. So I really appreciate all that all of you are doing collectively to leverage that to make more of a difference. And so I thought I would just talk a little bit about how I ended up sort of engaged in these issues and then love to make it a conversation. Um, and I should say that a lot of when I started at the New York Times, I was covering international economics. It was not these obvious human rights issues. But it sort of emerged really because of the people I encountered along the way. And maybe like some of you, the stories that just haunt you. And, I've written a lot about sexual violence and a lot about sex trafficking. And that began when I did what I thought was going to be one story on the topic, and I was based in Tokyo and went around Asia and was writing about child trafficking. And in Cambodia, I got to a village called Svaipak that was full of young girls who had been kidnapped and were locked up there and were being sold for their virginity. And they talked about how if they had managed to escape, the police would arrest them and hand them right back to the brothel owners. And I realized that these girls, this felt to me just like 19th century slavery, but they were going to be dead of AIDS by their 20s. And it was very hard to then go back to writing about yen dollar exchange rates and things like that. And to see that there are ways, imperfect ways, that we can chip away at these kind of problems and make a difference. And that part of it is just highlighting those problems and thinking about it and having the empathy to understand these are kids just like our own. Um, and similarly, I made one trip 20 years ago to cover the atrocities in Darfur. And then again, you just can't, these massacres haunt you, these kids haunt you. And so you want to go back and you want to fight with the tools you have. And my tools are a camera and a laptop. And so that led me there again and again. And I should say that some of the folks doing truly heroic work on the ground in really dangerous circumstances where there were from SAVE and other international NGOs at a time when governments were largely averting their eyes. And having reported on these kinds of things around the world and seen them, I needed to heal. And so I'd come back to the family farm here in Oregon. That's where I am right now. And to hang out with friends. And that's where I saw that I was returning from a humanitarian crisis abroad to a humanitarian crisis at home. And essentially, this had been my little town of Yamhill, population 1,000 on a good day. Traditionally, had been a fairly low education area. And that was because people could get a job at the sawmill or in agriculture in one of the local factories. And biggest employer was a glove factory. And those jobs went away and meth arrived and the community unraveled very, very quickly. So Jen mentioned the Knapp family. And they were the kids who got on the bus right after me. Farland Knapp was the oldest. He was my year in school. Then Zeelan, then his brother Nathan, then their sister Regina, and their baby brother Keelan. None of the Knapps graduated from high school. Oh, we're very talented, very smart. But none graduated from high school. Those good union jobs went away. Farland died of liver failure from drug and alcohol abuse, and was also the first to cook meth in this area. Then his brother Zeeland died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. His brother Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. their sister Regina died of hepatitis from IV drug use, and Keelan died. Keelan was shielded for much of his adulthood because he was in the state penitentiary for drug crimes. But then he was released at the beginning of the pandemic, and a month into the pandemic, he died of an overdose. He was used to heroin, and he apparently encountered fentanyl, as far as we can tell. And their mom is in their 80s, still walks up the hill every day to visit the graves of her 5 dead children. And I think, like Jen, I've struggled to understand how a community that I grew up in, surrounded by smart, talented kids who at one point seemed to have, a great future, how this all fell apart so quickly. And realizing that this wasn't one community, wasn't the local water, but was something much deeper that was happening across the country in working class communities. And at this point, more than a third of the kids on my old school bus are gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. More than a third. They they suffered greatly, but frankly, they also inflicted great suffering on others. Uh, you know, hurt is transitive. Kids hurt, but hurt kids also hurt others. And it's been, I've written, maybe because I've written so much about sexual violence, one of the things that has been hard for me to understand is that 2 of the boys on my old school bus, both were convicted and sent to prison for raping very young girls. How can this be? 2 boys on one small bus. And we spent a ton of money incarcerating those, my friends. I think we would have been much, much better off investing in, for example, home visiting programs, whether SAVES or nurse family partnerships or any others, and working with parents, supporting parents, making sure that kids got good pre-K and early childhood interventions, making sure they graduated from high school, had some kind of a path after that. And we didn't do that. And I look back and I wonder, what were the adults thinking when I was in school and they let all these kids drop out and head for a really traumatized future? And now I think, what are adults thinking today when we let 1 in 7 kids around the US still drop out of high school and head for, if you drop out of high school in 2024, you're cooked. Your kids are cooked. And yet we still have tolerated that. The book is Chasing Hope. And so let me just leave you on a little hopeful thread, because I've been kind of neglecting the hope part of it. And I do think that, Archbishop Desmond Tutu was a hero of mine, somebody I worked with on Darfur, and he had to deal with apartheid, with brutal homophobia, with brutal xenophobia in South Africa. And he always argued that despair is paralyzing. And if you despair, you've lost already, and that despair becomes self-fulfilling. But that hope is empowering. Not hope is this sort of blind, myopic kind of confidence that everything will work out, but a hope is a seed, that a muscle that if you put your shoulder to the wheel, that we can perhaps have better outcomes. And that's the best path to get there. And I really have seen that, and I think that's true. And some of the most intractable problems we've seen, we've registered real progress. I used to think that that sex trafficking in India was completely hopeless. And because people raised these issues and pushed and provided alternatives and so on, the number of children in brothels in Calcutta has dropped, I think it was 60% or 70%. And teen births have been a huge problem in the US. Since the modern peak in 1991, we've reduced them 70%. And that's by evidence-based approaches, better comprehensive sex education, more access to long-acting reversible contraceptives, giving young people some sense that they can have a better alternative if they don't get pregnant as teens. And so we We have tools. We have the resources. The question is, can we muster those resources to help those in greatest need? Um, and one last story that maybe because I believe so much in the power of education that always kind of inspires me. I reported in rural Pakistan on this extraordinary woman, Mukhtar Mai, and Mukhtar had been sentenced to be gang raped by a village council as punishment for something that her brother supposedly had done. In fact, probably her brother didn't do it, but that was the story. And so the village council then carried out that sentence. They gang raped her, and their expectation was that she would then kill herself out of shame. And instead, Mukhtar found it within herself to report the crime, to prosecute her attackers, to send them to prison, and then to use compensation money to start the first school in her village because she believed that education was the best way to chip away at the kind of misogyny and cruelty and violence against women that permeated her area. And then she enrolled the children of her attackers in her school. And you just can't be in that little village of Mirwala and see all these kids in their little school uniforms learning Urdu and including the children of those attackers and talk to Mukhtar and not feel that we are capable of extraordinary things when we are challenged and that we can do better on these challenges that are all around us, both abroad and at home. And, that's what all of you are at the forefront of. So I want to thank you for your leadership on that. And it really does make a difference in places like Mirwala, in places like Sudan, where I'm headed next, and in places like Yamhill, Oregon, where I am right now. So thank you all, and put me on the spot.
Okay, that's my job. I get to lob out some questions, but first of all, Nick, really, I want to thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your perspective with us and helping us find the hope. I'm Corinne Bassler. If you don't know me, I'm co-chair with Anya of this powerful group of 100 Strong, and I'm also a Save the Children trustee and a frequent flyer. I hop on as many trips as I possibly can. So Nick, I really enjoyed reading this book. I'm lucky I get to be on Martha's Vineyard. I literally was like floating in my pool reading the book. The entire bottom of my book is wet. The pages are all re-dried. But I plan to pass it to my niece who went to the School of Journalism in Columbia and is continuing in your fine tradition of being a journalist. So she can't wait to get her hands on it. I really enjoyed reading about your family history because it helps us understand, what shaped you. And I especially love that you included your love story with Cheryl because you two are couple goals. The things she's put up with, no. But really amazing. So there are so many great quotes in the book. One of my favorite was actually you quoting someone else, but it really stuck with me. You said, writing is easy. You just open a vein and bleed. And I feel that when I read anything that you write, like your humanity and your empathy really stand out as being such an inspiration to so many. So speaking as a fellow intrepid traveler, I haven't been as many dangerous situations as you, but I've visited many regions that are impacted by crisis and adversity, as have many people on this call. So I felt immediate connection to this book. When you're on these trips, literally, you're in the midst of people's suffering. And it's so humbling and also somewhat paralyzing. Almost all you can do really is just bear witness. And of course, it's reassuring to know that Save the Children is there with programs and helping. But you return home to your life, and all you want to do is talk about what you've seen. And you want to make people care about what it is you've seen, about the stories you told, the gut-wrenching situations that others live in. So it's really hard to listen to a friend complaining about the barista who got their latte order wrong when you've seen what is really happening in the world. And it's also hard not to sort of lecture them on that, right? You have to find that, happy median of introducing them to these topics and trying to make them care. So in that spirit, my first question is this. In your interview with Cambridge Day, you said you were motivated by the idea that if journalists covered a difficult topic, we can make people spill their coffee and lead them to take actions. Can you cite an example other than Sierra Leone, which we already heard, and your before writing, of when your writing did this and did drive better outcomes?
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned sex trafficking, and I think that's a case. It sort of surprised people that sex trafficking ends up on the op-ed page of the New York Times. It's not a, normally we tend to cover politics, this kind of thing, and yet when you've got millions of girls and young women who are trafficked and held in brothels around the world. I mean, the UN at one point estimated that in Asia alone, 1 million girls are being trafficked into brothels each year. When you have a scale at that level, then it does seem to be a vast human rights issue that should be on the agenda. And it turns out that if you kind of break the ice and put it on the agenda, then people do begin to raise the issue. And then the U.S. Passed important Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which led diplomats to raise the issue with foreign ministry officials and encourage police to stop taking bribes from traffickers, but actually occasionally to prosecute them. And there was one town in Cambodia where I'd reported regularly on trafficking, and gotten to know one brothel owner quite well, a woman who just, she just found she could make more money kidnapping rural girls and selling them than she could, selling pirated videos or stealing motorcycles or something. And the police, under this pressure, they didn't close her brothel, but they began to demand more in bribes for her to keep it open. And that eroded her business model. And so she closed her brothel and opened a grocery store. And, look, this is pretty imperfect justice. There was no, there was no justice for all the past things she'd done, but it at least meant she was no longer kidnapping these girls and having them raped. And I have seen that. That was sort of micro thing in one brothel in one country, but likewise, over the last 25 years, I've seen some real progress on trafficking both abroad and here at home. And pimps in this country are also it used to be that just the girls on the street were being arrested, the victims were being prosecuted. Now the pimps are at some real risk, and that is some progress, and lots of people worked on it, but maybe shining a light on it helped a little bit as well.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah, the awareness around trafficking it's gone from something that was really kept in the dark to now you can be in an airport and there will be big signs that say, look for this. And I really do credit you and journalists who have focused the attention on it, people who think it can't happen here, and it's happening right under our noses. So thank you for that answer. My next question is,
Corinne, the airports. I've got to say that I always, I'm not sure that those airport announcements actually really do so much good, but I do think that, improving home visiting and helping deal with poverty around the country and more parent coaching, more efforts to address chaotic homes around the U.S., dealing with our foster care system. So many girls who end up trafficked or emerging from foster care, that I wish that more people were using the SAVE playbook, rather than the airport announcement playbook, to try to address this very real problem in the U.S.
Well, I think it comes down to, marketing, working with marketing at the bigger level to raise awareness around the issues, that they are issues, so you can sort of focus in and actually create some solutions. So, but yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, the announcements are a little weird. I was talking about the big billboards you see, and also posted in bathrooms and things. It's around us now, which is at least raising awareness for the topic. So my other question is, considering your extensive experience in reporting around the globe and in some of the most disadvantaged areas of rural America, you've seen firsthand the complex, seemingly insurmountable challenges that children face. So how can collaboration between journalists and humanitarian organizations such as SAVE lead to more impactful solutions on a global scale? So again, how do we together make people care?
So I think that actually NGOs like SAVE are going to be more and more important to keep these issues on the global agenda. And that's because the business model for international coverage in journalism has largely collapsed. The New York Times still sends correspondence out. Um, Watch Post does, but in general, the Boston Globe doesn't have any foreign correspondence anymore. And in general, if you are watching the TV or if you are reading a local newspaper, you're probably no longer reading a news magazine because they barely exist anymore, then you're not seeing coverage of international humanitarian issues. And on TV, the war in Ukraine still gets attention. The war in Gaza gets attention. Sudan has gotten almost no attention. The crisis in Yemen has gotten almost no attention. Syria, Cameroon. There are all these sort of global important crises that aren't getting attention because they're expensive to cover. They're dangerous to cover. And I think that one thing we're going to have to explore looking ahead, if we're going to get these issues before the public, is some kind of partnerships in which uh, reporters and photographers work with international NGOs, or maybe it's staff of those aid, maybe it's those aid workers who are carrying a camera more and they're documenting crises, and then news organizations are publishing their work. But I think we're going to have to figure out some ways to cover these kinds of crises. The trend to save work in Sierra Leone, for example, on child marriage. That was, that's really important. Child marriage is an incredibly important issue around the world. I forget, every X number of seconds, a girl is married somewhere in the world. And yet that we don't really cover that anymore. And there should be ways of getting those kinds of issues in news organizations, on TV, and given the economics of it, I don't think that's going to come from the news organizations themselves, but maybe there are partnerships that we can forge so that aid worker in Sierra Leone is recording things on an iPhone, and then that's ending up on CNN or ABC or NBC or whatever. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about that on that topic.
Well, I think I'm hearing you say, Nick, that you want to embed with Save the Children and be on the front lines and actually be our correspondent. It is scary because we are pushing more of this down on our aid workers because, frankly, sometimes they're the only people being allowed into these places and journalists aren't. So, we're not trained to tell the story. So I do see some kind of collaboration there in our future, some media training, if you were. But anyway, thank you so much for answering my questions. I don't want to take up all the time. I could fangirl all afternoon and ask many more softball questions. Anyway, but I would like to open it up to anyone in the group who has a question or a comment for Nick. Just raise your hand. Oh, okay. I see Joanne.
Hi, Nick. What role do you think both governments, national governments, and the United Nations have in this collaboration? I'm thinking in specifically of a place like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which has like 800 correspondents, so they're actually out there, but I don't know how much their reporting gets into the bloodstream. And I know there's real questions of government and a free press working together. On the other hand, how do we get stories out? What do you see as the relationship? Do you see that evolving?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, I think have enormous reporting assets that haven't been leveraged adequately and don't have the readership that that could be brought to bear in places that aren't covered much. I'm not sure how we fix that, and there's there's also, unfortunately, a kind of a partisan debate about those U.S.-sponsored news organizations and how, to what extent they should be speaking for the U.S. government. In terms of the UN and NGOs, I think that there is, that there is more we can do. Right now, I'm just trying to get to Sudan in a couple of weeks, and the UN has been actually quite helpful in trying to get me across the border from Chad into Sudan. The UN and international NGOs also have reasonably good safety protocols, and so the Times security people feel more confident if I'm in a vehicle, in a UN vehicle, than if I'm just, rented a car that may belong to some kidnappers and pay them a lot of money to take me over the border. And so I think, and when for example, in the past, well, I think it was maybe the very last time. No, it wasn't last time, but one of my trips into Sudan. I mean, Sudan, when I was covering the genocide, they obviously were not eager to give visas to reporters covering it. But but I was able to accompany the Secretary General. He was making a 2-hour stopover in Darfur on the way to Nairobi, and so he let me come along with him. Then, by prior arrangement, I missed the plane out. And then there I was in Darfur. The Sudanese authorities didn't know I was there. And so I was free to report. I wasn't being followed. That was possible only because the UN let me on the plane and then let me miss the plane out, knowing that I was kind of breaking the rules. I should say that it was a little complicated because I saw at the checkpoints these UN workers with their UN passes going through the checkpoints. And of course, I didn't have that. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to get through. But then I realized that the soldiers at the checkpoints, they couldn't read English, and they probably couldn't even read Arabic. And these passes were in English. So I just went up to the first checkpoint and waved my United Airlines Mileage Plus card. It's amazing the respect people have for United Airlines at checkpoints when they're busy, massacring people there. But I do think that UN and to some degree governments can help us get coverage for some of these issues. But we also are going to have to, make sure we preserve our independence and protect ourselves doing that. I've been trying to get into Gaza through the UN. I've been unable to do that. But there's certainly more opportunity on both sides for us to work together.
Thank you.
Did I see Jennifer with her hand up?
Hello, everyone. Nick and Jennifer, thank you for the light that you continue to shine on this work. It's a gift to be with you. I happen to work in a Boston Public High School that is a immigrant community with high trauma and considerable pain that they deal with. I work for financial aid to bring first-generation students to college in an affordable path. The trauma piece is enormous. And I think of you as the person experiencing it indirectly, but it is such a part of your work. And then the families and children that are suffering. One of the most powerful books I've read on that is called My Grandmother's Hands. And I always try to tell people about that book because it's an incredible contribution. And it helps all of us process and metabolize trauma is the way that it's described. But I'd love to hear more about how you deal with that. And I'm interested in supporting trauma work for these families. I think that's the heart of everything. And I'd love to learn more about what you are seeing in that regard.
I think that's such an important question. And I think we're all beginning to learn that trauma is a huge source of problems that people face many, many years later as adults. I think historically we tended to think about, physical ailments, malnutrition, and things like that, and thought that kids were endlessly resilient. And I think what we're learning is that there's actually a little less resilience than we might have expected, and that um, early exposures to violence, to sexual abuse, things like this, that they haunt kids and they impede their education, they impede their longer outcomes. I mentioned my friends, the Knapps. Farland, I mean, they grew up with their dad brutally beating and sometimes shooting at their mom when they were growing up. Farland spent his childhood wanting to murder his dad, and he was very open about that. What does that do to a kid when your main ambition in life is to kill your dad? Um, and likewise, the you know, I think that there is more sexual abuse that happens, especially in dysfunctional homes, chaotic homes around the country, and I think that that has more longstanding consequences, that more people numb that pain with drugs and alcohol than we believe. And that's one reason why we have to do a better job, including in those early years before kids have some lifeline access to an adult who can help. Uh, and so I think I think we need to do a much better job trying to address, trying to reduce trauma in the early years, and then trying to address it and heal it in school. Um, on, I think your question was also partly about me, and one of the things I kind of realized in writing Chasing Hope, I sort of self-diagnosed myself to some degree with a mild case of PTSD from seeing too many massacres and being shot at too many times and held at gunpoint too many times. And it does, your gut clenches and you spend a lot of time scared. And at some point, your gut doesn't unclench quite as well, I guess. I I was really lucky to be able to come back and, to this family that was incredibly healing and supportive. Um, and to friends and I think that all helped. I also I become a great backpacker, and I think that there's a certain amount of self-prescribed wilderness therapy that has helped me. Um, I've also wondered about these kind of community links and social connections. I think that I wonder sometimes why the Great Depression didn't cause more drug and alcohol abuse, for example, more dysfunction than it did. And I think that the answer is that there were community bonds and strong family bonds in the 1930s in a way that there have not been in the last 15 or 20 years. And so people now don't have the kind of buffers from outside economic pressures that they maybe had 60 years ago. Um, and but the the point about trauma, especially childhood trauma, and the ways in which it affects and shapes people for many, many decades to come, I think is absolutely critical. And we talk a lot about how to deal with drug and alcohol abuse, as we should, and that's got to involve better treatment, things like this. But it also has to involve the roots of the underlying factors, including trauma, that often drive people to numb themselves and to self-medicate.
Sorry, Joanne, is your hand up? Oh, Joanne, you're on mute.
You're muted, I think.
Sorry, I was going to say some of the most impactful ways that reach the public, Jennifer, you know this, Nick know this, is through narrative, it's through story, through film. And so somehow it seems to me there's a way to get some of these stories out and I'm a writer, so I understand this, through character and through the narrative and the stories that are told, that people tune into just because they like a good story. And of course, every good story at some point finds its harmony and its hope, because it knits all these disparate pieces together to find that unity of narrative. And so I hope the two of you might think about something like that. I think that's a big place, even beyond books, where you reach young people and people of all generations and all backgrounds. Just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, things like movies like Hotel Rwanda. I mean, there are a bunch of movies that have really had that impact. Some TV shows to try to do that. Jen, what do you think? Are there more avenues to, to have popular culture tell narratives that in ways that expose people to issues?
Yeah, I think there definitely are. It's very tricky though, because you have to ride that line of not, and this is
Preaching.
a term, but not preaching, not not showing poverty porn, and not, it's like, what is that story? Who are those writers? I've spent the last 20 years looking for them, and they are really, they're very, very few and far between that are done well.
It's usually character driven. I mean,
Yeah, of course.
it has to be character driven, but just a thought.
Why don't you write something for us, Julian?
I'll think about it.
Okay, all right.
Corinne, I saw Carolyn Miles and Anne Malloy as well had questions.
Yeah,
Great.
so
Kara?
so great to see you guys, Nick and Jen and all our 100 strong leaders. So one of the things, Nick, that I know you talk about in all of your books, but I wonder if we can be even more effective, is when kids themselves, and especially girls, have their own agency and they really speak out. I think one of the things that so impressed us, the group of us that went to Sierra Leone last year, was the girls themselves and their ability to kind of push back on this idea, in this case, of child marriage, and to stand up for themselves. It takes a lot of support around them to be able to do that. But I'm just interested in some of the stories of kids that that made it out. So the Knapp family, super sad. The kids that were, obviously you're one of them, that made it, to a different place from that environment. And if you think there are particular things that we as adults can do to make that possible.
I mean, Carolyn, you were a champion in recognizing the importance of educating girls and as a pathway to change around the world. And I think that's absolutely right. And if we can do a better job of educating girls, bringing them into the workforce, allowing them control over financial assets, over incomes, that also means that they do that more of those assets go toward raising their children and educating their children. Whereas, you give more assets and income to us men, too often that ends up being used for beer, whatever. I've got to say, and I think that remains a huge challenge around the developing world. I've got to say that in the US, I think we need to rethink gender to some degree. That when we've had gender conversations about the US, it's traditionally been about lack of opportunities for women. And what we're increasingly seeing in the US is boys and men who are struggling. And that's not to say that, that we have equality for women at all. But if you look at who is dropping out of high school today, it's overwhelmingly boys. At who isn't learning to read in the US, it's boys. At who is dying of overdoses, it's boys. Who is having contact with the criminal justice system, it's boys, etc. And just as we can't have a healthy society without without educated girls and women being a real part of that society, we can't have one where there is this huge education gap and kind of lack of hope among boys and men. The education gap in American colleges. So if you if you look at the male-female gap among undergraduates in the US today, it's a greater gender gap than existed when Title IX was introduced, but it's the reverse. It's more a greater gap, more women than men in colleges. And we created an architecture to support women in education in the US. We didn't for boys and men. And I'm just struck by how many boys are floundering around the US and in, as I said earlier, not just suffering pain, but also inflicting it on others. And so that's kind of a part of the gender conversation that I'm thinking and puzzling about, and I know others are too. I was struck that Melinda Gates, when she was donating money to gender-focused organizations, that one of those grants went to Richard Reeve's organization supporting boys and men, which was sort of unexpected, but indeed to think about gender challenges today in the US and otherwise in the industrialized world, the struggles and failures of boys and men are a big part of that. And I would never have thought I'd be saying this 20 years ago. Just never imagined it.
And maybe
Yeah.
in the US, it's agency of voice that we need to be spending more time on. So,
Anne, did you have a question?
Yes. First of all, I'm really enjoying the book, Nick. Thank you to Save the Children for sending it out to all of us to read. I haven't quite finished it because I've had a week of travel and I don't take a hard-covered book with me when I travel. I travel very light. So it had to be set aside for a week, but I'll finish it over the next day or so. But anyway, my question's kind of related to what you were just talking about. And Carolyn, I'm just curious about how Yamhill is doing. And you saw so much destruction in your own community and you're back there. Do you see, are things being done to improve the situation? I mean, it's just to see a whole family get wiped out is horrific. And I'm sure that wasn't the only family that has suffered. And are things happening in a small community like Yamhill?
I'd say things have not obviously improved. Things definitely got worse during the pandemic. And people who were in recovery, all of a sudden they lost their in-person meetings. They lost the accountability of having urine tests for drugs. And so there were a lot of people who resumed their access to drugs, and then kids who were raised in those households, they weren't going to school, so they no longer had a teacher or some other adult whom they could speak to if they were being abused, or who could get them books. And the effort to attend school remotely in communities that didn't have internet that was a complete failure for working class kids around the country. And I really do worry about the kind of the drug and alcohol abuse problem. I think that our strategy in many ways has been based on intercepting imports, and we obviously have to try that, but the shift to synthetic drugs, I think, has made that a lot more difficult. That no longer do you have, poppy fields that you can intervene on. Now it's all done in a lab with precursor drugs sent from China, and the quantities are so tiny and so easy to ship across the border that I think it's very difficult to intercept. And you see that in prices of drugs. It used to cost $20 in Yamhill or in Portland to get high. Now it costs $2. It means it's a lot more accessible to young kids. And as we know, young kids are, have real mental health crises and self-medicate. Fentanyl is a lot scarier than heroin was, but their other nitazene is the next drug that's going to take over after fentanyl, and it's 10 times more potent than even fentanyl is. And I think synthetic meth is a lot worse than the traditional meth. So that's one reason why I think we have to do a better job reducing the demand, not just the supply. And I think reducing the demand is going to be getting kids to thrive in school, getting kids to read by the end of 3rd grade, getting them in pre-K, giving them home visitation, parental support for those kids who most need it. And I don't think we're doing a great job at that around the country. You look at chronic absenteeism rates around the country, and something like 30% of kids in public schools around the country are chronically absent. High school dropout rates are still very high. So many kids aren't learning to be literate or numerate. Community college, we talk a good game about making it more accessible, but it's still not. Most kids, the military is a lifeline for a lot of working class kids, but a majority of kids who need it aren't eligible for the military because they haven't graduated from high school. They can't pass a drug test. They have a criminal conviction. They can't pass the physical or cognitive tests. And so I do worry that we are failing kids who most need us around the country. And we all do a great job investing in our own kids, but we've been largely indifferent as a country in investing in human capital of other people's kids.
I think we'll take one more question, Susan, if that's okay with everyone, and then we'll wrap up.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And this is just incredible. And I love all of your books, Nick. Yeah, and thank you so much for bringing the stories back in such a compelling way. At some point, I'd love to talk to you about, you have such an intimate personal way of writing, is to whom are you speaking? I'd love to know a little bit more about that. But my question has to do with the role of we're all looking for solutions, and identifying the problem is important to that. So I'm curious about social isolation and loneliness. I was struck by Vivek Murthy's report on the epidemic of loneliness that really hit me and rings true. And you think about the role of social media, all of that. But what do you think about addressing loneliness and social isolation as one of the target areas to focus on, either through education, through whatever the connections are, but really targeting social isolation and loneliness as a critical enemy?
I'm a huge believer in that. I think that loneliness, I mean, I think it was the Surgeon General who was originally estimating that loneliness is equivalent in terms of reducing life expectancy to smoking 18 cigarettes a day or something like that. And I see that among folks around here in Yamhill, and that when they lose a job that provides meaning and purpose, then they just kind of sit around on the couch, and they no longer have those networks and that can buffer that, and that can give them that sense, that the way of finding relief. I do think that other countries have been somewhat ahead of us, the UK in particular, Australia too, in providing in trying to look at how we can address loneliness, and some things seem to work to some degree. One thing a bunch of countries have done that I just kind of love is talking benches, where you have a bench in a public park, and the bench is identified as, it's okay to talk to somebody else who sits on this bench. And so if you're a little bit lonely, you can go sit on the talking bench, and then somebody else may happen by, and then you can just chat about the birds or whatever it may be. Britain has also, I think, done a really good job in promoting volunteering as a way of getting people out and giving them a sense of purpose and supporting the community. And it can be through some volunteer activity that addresses other people's loneliness, but it also addresses the volunteers' loneliness. And there, there have been experiments with pets and animals to support loneliness. I think, I think Britain has a minister for loneliness, and I think that was a really smart move to get somebody thinking deep questions about how we address this. And I also, frankly, tend to think that the loneliness problem may get worse, not only because of the internet, but also because we're seeing an increasing gender divide, not just in the US, but around the industrialized world, and young men becoming more anti-feminist, more kind of Andrew Tate supporting, more conservative, and young women becoming more feminist, more skeptical of men. And, if that gender divide continues, it's a little harder for nature to take its course in young people to, to solve their problems by finding each other. And I guess though, I just want to leave you on one note. We talked about a lot of these big problems, including loneliness, and Corinne had mentioned just how they can seem kind of paralyzing and overwhelming. And I think that's true, but I think we often also think that that progress is only about solving problems. And, we're not going to solve loneliness. We're not going to solve lack of education, dropout rates, and so on. But I'm just a big believer in that progress isn't just about solving a problem in its entirety. And I would just speak to my own example that my dad, he was a World War II refugee. And when a family in Portland sponsored his way to the US, that did not solve the global refugee problem, didn't make a dent in the global refugee problem, but was completely transformative for the Kristofs. And likewise, Save and all of us here, for all of our efforts, we're not going to solve today's refugee problem. We're not going to solve the problem in Gaza or in Sudan or in Yamhill, but all of us can make a considerable impact on any number of families and turn their lives around and provide opportunities that are incredibly enriching for them. And, that's this incredible power that we have in 2024. So thank you to Save, and thank you to all of you for what you're doing to empower families and transform their opportunities the way mine was transformed when my dad was brought to the US.
Nick, thank you so much, and what a great way to summarize. And I think it's true that you can't focus on the overwhelming situation, but you can focus on one person and their story and make a commitment to help them. And maybe that's enough, right? So thank you so much for joining us today. The book was amazing. Please, everyone, if you haven't had a chance to read it. And I just have a couple highlights. We have the Kentucky trip coming up. If anyone's interested, reach out to Mary and she can get you connected. And in October, we're going to do a joint conversation again with the board. And this is going to be sort of a pre-election discussion around bipartisan support to help kids across the U.S. So I think it's going to be as inspirational as this talk. So thank you everyone for joining us, and especially Jen and Nick. Thank you guys. It was so great to have you all today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So happy to
Take
be here.
care.
Thanks.
you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.